Well, hello everybody, and welcome again to our weekly Japan Club podcast. And
This
so
is
everyone here has been on the show once already, so we don't need to go through all that lengthy introduction as if all of our previous introductions were particularly lengthy.
Yeah, exactly. What are you talking
Yeah.
about?
One of your hosts, Yuki.
I'm Ernesto. Yeah.
First two names. I'm Jerry.
I'm Bryce, as you can tell by the name tag right below my picture.
Yeah, well, sometimes you forget those exist. So.
Look, the podcast. We have to account for those who would not be watching the video, but I don't think we have any audio-only sources up right now, so...
No.
Well, I don't know. There's always those people who keep the YouTube open.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But regardless, this is a very unusual episode of our podcast today because today we're featuring a historical episode, an episode covering the history of Japan, as it were. In moderate depth, none of us claim to be history experts in any conceivable way, but perhaps we could teach you guys a thing or two. So today we're going to work chronologically. So today we're going to be starting off with the earliest known information about Japan, maybe cover some of those creation myths that people like so much, shows up a lot in pop culture, for instance. So we'll do a lot of that and we will have fun today. So really just to dive right in, who wants to really just sort of give an intro into these earliest parts of Japan? I could cover some background if we need be. Have anything they'd like to start us with? Some, keywords, as it were?
Keywords. Like a world history textbook. What are the keywords for Japanese history?
Well, if we're talking about the earliest kind of evidence of people in Japan, if any of you have seen, which I think a lot of you have, Bill Wurtz's video on the history of Japan, it's believed that people crossed over from Siberia into Japan when there was an ice bridge there a long time ago. After that, people were living as hunter-gatherers, and eventually they started, farming and stuff. And once that started, you had kind of these divisions of land which belonged to a certain person that was kind of the powerful guy in the area, and that was kind of the beginnings of the kind of warring states condition that Japan found itself in for a long time.
Yeah, Japan begins as a typical hunter-gatherer society in terms of how most human civilizations tend to accumulate, although it is probable that the civilization would develop a bit later than the more typical river valley civilizations that kind of cropped up. As people began to spread out more, populations began to expand, they would then move to areas further away. Japan is no different. Unlike most other major civilizations, Japan never had a river valley to work with. So,
the thing to note with that, the ice bridge that people crossed over on disintegrated very quickly. And on top of that,
period of isolation.
Was it? I'm a bit confused. Was it an ice bridge or was it a land bridge because the sea was lower?
No, I'm pretty sure it was an ice bridge
of sorts.
So,
ice or land, it disintegrated.
During the ice age, there were quite a few of those, like these kind of ice land areas that people could cross over. A notable example, of course, would be the sort of Siberia into the United States area where people cross over.
I'm aware that was a land bridge. It was a Bering Land Bridge.
Yeah, but those were made possible due to the ice age for the most part, and people migrated during that time and then got cut off as
trying to cover our accuracy.
Because continents, they move around, but they wouldn't have moved around so much that like the United States as Alaska region would connect to Siberia in any way.
Well, the idea is that during the ice age,
I confirmed it is a land bridge, and the reason that it disappeared was because after the ice age, all the water that melted just kind of sank it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
so it has
when there's
something
ice,
to do
that
with
water
ice.
comes from the ocean, right? So when the ice melts, the ocean, rises. That's the base idea.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. The details are a bit foggy. This is not an episode about tectonic.
All right, I can cover basic geology.
I didn't question the ice bridge. I just know it was a bridge, bro. I didn't know it was
Yeah.
ice or land.
I got you.
My boy.
So, from around like 30,000 years ago to about like 30,000 BC to about 1,000 BC, it was mostly just, there weren't a whole lot of huge historical events that really happened, at least insofar as what we know, because hunter-gatherer societies aren't exactly great at writing things down.
Mm-hmm.
All we
Especially
have are
ones.
like weapons that we found, maybe the occasional skeleton that could tell us a few things about tribal lifestyle and, pottery and all these other goods that they made. But those give us only a small glimpse into the life of the average Japanese hunter-gatherer.
Gives us an even smaller glimpse is the fact that Japan's like what 70% mountain. Makes it kind of hard to pick a place to stay.
Yeah.
So in general, there's not a whole lot to really say in regards to early Japan. All we know is that China acknowledged Japan's existence to a small extent in some of their writing. In sort of the area right around like 500 BC to earlier than that, around that time period, give or take a couple centuries.
I think being mountainous, there's probably not a lot of opportunities for like fossilized evidence to really form. So it's probably hard to like stuff like that archaeology.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, unless like for the most part, societies tend to transition into agriculture right around the time they sort of have the technology to do so, as well as they've observed it from other people. So it's a lot of cultural spread of information. And so China had discovered rice cultivation some time ago, and those techniques would have been carried over to people to Japan, and then that would have led to the transition from hunter-gatherer to sort of a more agricultural society, which would then expand. And really that's where things begin in terms of like Japan as a historical entity, because before that it was just kind of a land. Anyone who's played Civ 5 could tell you like the early part of the game is literally just you not interacting with anybody and just wandering around. It's kind of similar to that.
That's more or less how it went, because that was what the Yayoi Jidai, which is considered the Bronze Age of Japan, where they got a lot of information about how to make things better than what they were currently doing. So that's where they got all the technological advancement that Yuki was talking about, specifically rice cultivation, which had the arguably largest impact on pushing cultural development further. Ernesto mentioned earlier how people would be in charge of plots of land, and those people who had power. This is the time frame when that really started to take hold. There would be people who would not necessarily watch over a village, but would just have some sort of declared ownership over a vast tract of land, and because they're the ones in charge of the land, they're the ones with all the power and the ones that people look to for advice in terms of what they do next.
So yeah, I think we just have the Chinese writings to really talk about Japan. They used to call it Wa, which is Chinese for small or little. Kind of jab at the overall size of the landmass there, which, to be fair, compared to China, Japan is pretty tiny. So there, but
one thing that always kind of makes me angry about looking at maps is that they're not actually to scale, which I don't like. Like, have you been on that website where it tells you like what the actual size of something is? You can move the countries around.
That's an inevitability with how maps can't perfectly represent like a curved area. So there has to be some distortion. So.
But still, it's like
there are maps that try to preserve size as much as possible, but usually that results in a like difference in shape, right? So there's a lot of compromise that happens.
Yeah, but still, it's kind of misleading.
It's not intentionally misleading. It's just you misconstrue the purpose of maps sometimes. Like Mercator is good for navigation, right? Preserves angles across like latitude. But if for like actual like gauging the size of things, there's better options. I'll just say that right now.
I see. And Jerry, you know a lot about geography, man. Geography and maps.
Oceanography is kind of my thing, so I'll try with that.
Oh shit. Kanko? How's your link?
What? Naval history, you mean?
Naval history?
So wait, Bryce, around what time did the Yayoi period begin and end, and sort of what marks the separation? Do you know anything specific about that, or?
Yayoi began what 300 BC, I think, and lasted till around 300 AD.
Okay.
So about like pretty decent chunk of time. Uh, what part about the end? I think what ended it. I
If
think
I recall
it
correctly,
ended because they had, like finished accumulating as much wealth as possible. So
I
it was
think it
concentrated
was.
and led to the creation of an emperor.
Yeah, I think that was it. It was the first unification of Japan, I believe, is the separate
Yeah.
because the term
Was that when the
Yamatai.
Yamato line came in?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
sort of where
yeah, okay.
that word came from, is the early power to really consolidate their influence in Japan, and we use that word to this day to refer to the Japanese people as a
Mhm.
population. So it was a pretty big deal, and it began the Kofun period, which was a period of expansion of Japanese influence, maybe actually developing their own national identity to an extent. Like national is sort of a, it's not the right word to use there, because obviously nation states as they existed are kind of a modern concept,
Mm.
but some idea of like what it means to have this unique culture to yourself and how you can interact with foreign cultures. There is a bit of that really develops in this era.
Mhm.
There's actually a lot of interesting little things that come from the Kofun period. So, with regards to the Yamato line, if I'm remembering correctly, the current bloodline for the emperor still has like traces of Yamato DNA because of the way they of the way they married. So I don't remember the exact name of this other family. It led to a whole coup essentially. So the Yamato emperor would have a son, and that son, because they wanted to keep the bloodline pure, or at the very least as close to being purely Yamato as possible, would marry a relative that was not necessarily Yamato, but still like blood relative from like a distant cousin or something.
Mhm.
And the reason this kept happening was because that distant relative wanted to consolidate power, so they wanted the Yamato bloodline to get closer and closer to their bloodline. And so over time, it eventually led to like a whole political split that kind of bit them in the butt later during the Asuka period, because that's what caused the Asuka period. Um, but yeah, it is a day. The bloodline is still traceable back all the way to the Kofun period with the Yamato line, because they consolidated that enough power to kind of just marry whoever they want, not be questioned, as
Yeah,
emperors do.
according to Timothy Hoy, who wrote a book on Japanese politics, there is firm evidence for the hereditary line since Emperor Kinmei ascended to the throne 1500 years ago. So, yeah, they've been that's still considered the Yamato dynasty, the imperial house of Japan.
So yeah, no, this was a big period just in terms of like what we base a lot of Japan on, but in terms of like overall historical relevance as well as things like major impact, it's mostly what you would expect from a country coming into its own. Diplomatic relations were attempted with China and Korea and stuff like that, insofar as their national identities went. But we don't really know a whole lot of how that turned out. We have a couple of written records that exist, but from what I can gather, none of them were Japanese in nature, so they would be biased in a way that would take out some information, maybe add some
One
information that might not have been there. So
one note that I think was confirmed to be Japanese was a mystery sent to I don't know if it was the Chinese emperor or just it was sent to China from Japan. I guess just to continue conversation. And this is actually how Japan got its name. So you'll often hear people joke about the land of the rising sun. It's actually like an official thing that they wrote. So in order to put themselves on equal terms with China, because they had been referred to as you said earlier, little for literal years, they said from the land of the rising sun to this land of the setting sun, as the intro to the note, and then they continued on with their conversation, which really ticked off China. That's how Japan ended up with the name Nihon, just like sun and then origin, origin of the sun.
Yeah.
So that was their first, like, I guess, step into really identifying themselves as a player in the political field
So
all
yeah,
those
like
years ago.
this is probably not relevant for quite some time, but I'm wondering why we call it Japan nowadays, even though
Yeah,
nobody,
exactly.
Absolutely no idea.
because like in Japan proper, nobody calls it Japan. Like they call
Yeah.
it Nippon or Nippon.
Well, like it's probably something to do with like the other pronunciation of Japan's Japanese name, which is Nippon, and
Yeah.
then they probably took like some part of
There's
it.
some similarity there, but
Yeah, especially with like the more Latin pronunciations. You mean like Spanish is Japón, but
Mhm.
who knows? It's an
like
interesting
mostly I
topic of it.
assume that name really comes around during the era of colonization in like the 1800s,
Yeah.
just because that's really when Japan began to interact with European powers, and for the most part, those are the people who would call Japan Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it says it's okay. So it's directly from Portuguese, which came from a Malay word,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
from a Chinese word, yeah, meaning sunrise.
Yeah,
Um,
land of
So
the
the
rising sun.
Portuguese stole it from the
so
Chinese.
I don't want to butcher this. It says Jipun, and it says it's a pun, I believe.
It's a pun.
No, I think it says the equivalent of Nippon. So yeah, we were on the right track, I believe.
Yeah.
Um,
It makes sense that it's from Portuguese, but like, it's a pun.
Yeah.
it says earliest form was Marco Polo's Chipangu. I'm like,
Oh, okay. I
I
see.
it's pretty cool.
So it's just an evolution of language as it kind of got
Yeah, yeah,
translated.
yeah.
That's
Mhm.
probably
Nice.
Yeah.
that's probably the most accurate form
Yeah, I
of.
was worried there was some like I don't know, like derogatory history, but nah, we're
Yeah, I
good.
don't think so.
So,
Pretty chill.
Little.
speaking of the Kofun period, do you guys look at those tombs?
Those burial mounds that they're known for.
Yeah. No, and
They're
like the shape,
massive.
That's
it's
pretty cool.
such an interesting one. Like, there's an aerial picture here of the tomb of Emperor Nintoku in Osaka, and it's huge. Like, it's the size of like a big park. I don't know.
Is this the gateway to Kingdom Hearts?
Yeah, no,
Shaped like
they're
the Vatican.
insane.
Shaped like the Vatican.
Does anybody know like what their purpose was intended to be, or why they were shaped like keyholes?
That is, I mean, obviously, I don't think keyholes were really invented. I don't think that was the intended shape, but like
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't tell you. I think no, I don't know enough about like. I assume it's some sort of like reference to either a character or a shape that would be of significance, but
Mm-hmm.
like for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out, and I'm not entirely sure that. All I know is it probably has some significance to like if burial mounds in other civilizations are anything to go by, it'd be
Mm-hmm.
something along the lines of a blessing or like for the after passage into the afterlife, or perhaps some symbol of power. Those are pretty much one of the two major things that you would place on a burial mound.
I think they most closely resembled pyramids in function because, if I remember correctly, people would go, archaeologists obviously, would go through and they would find emperors dressed in like full gold regal attire and whatnot. So it was definitely, well, not definitely, but I think one of the functions of it was to place the royal lines or the nobles and whatnot in, I guess, their due respect upon death.
Mm-hmm.
Because by this point in time, Japan still had a great reverence for spirits.
I think my amateur interpretation of this is just the fact that it looks like a keyhole because it's like the burial mound itself and maybe some sort of entrance structure, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that.
I'm not like an entrance, but you know how pyramids sometimes have that cool like tunnel thing to like kind of symbolize entrance.
Yeah, most of the sources that I found just described it as being keyhole shaped, but they didn't explain why.
Yeah.
So, you know,
See,
whatever the
here's
reason
something
behind it.
interesting. They say also that like the possessions and valuables that were placed in the tomb were protected by terracotta figurines called haniwa. So that could be something similar to like the burial practices in ancient China.
Haniwa were they're
Well,
kind of
it's a
they're a bit
common
weird.
practice.
Like Haniwa were like these wooden or clay structures that could be of varying size, and so they could be as tall as a person, and they could be like this tall. So it all depends. Haniwa, like they're referenced occasionally in things like Japanese media. You'd see them. Those things in Animal Crossing that you can sometimes have.
Animal Crossing.
Oh, I
Wait.
love Japan. Dear God.
They're pretty close, if not just straight up Haniwa. But yeah.
Interesting.
Dude, it's so good.
Oh, and one other thing that's really important to talk about with respect to the Kofun period is the introduction of Buddhism from Korea.
Yeah,
I was gonna get to that.
Because if I remember correctly, the introduction of Buddhism also came along with like a new writing system, or
So so there's a lot that happened like towards the end of the Kofun period that like is what most people know about because it's what transitioned them into the subsequent period, which is the Asuka period. So there is young man by the name of Prince Shotoku who studied Buddhism, became a Buddhist, and wanted the rest of the country to at least somewhat agree with him. And by this point in time, the rest of the country was like, no, we like Shintoism, stop. And he continued to insist, and they, in Japanese fashion said no, but slightly softer. And suddenly, a couple years later, the whole country's Buddhist. So, but jokes aside, in his attempt to, I guess, convert the general populace to Buddhism, he ended up bringing like a lot of political reforms, and he actually brought hiragana over. So he redid the writing system to create hiragana. I think it was hiragana. So the most commonly seen and utilized syllabary out of the three kanji counts. Technically, that's a syllabary. So yeah, he the administrative changes that he brought as emperor eventually. I think actually no, he was not emperor, was he? Because he was under the empress, who was his aunt. I don't know if he was necessarily an emperor, but he still had a lot of authority and like created a whole new ranking system for the nobles. I think it was 12 level cap and rank, something like that, where the hat that they wore indicated their rank and their authority and whatnot. So he added a lot of bureaucracy to the country, which, kept things a bit more orderly and ushered in a whole new Jidai, a whole new era, rather.
So I looked into it, and after this prince that you talked about brought Buddhism into Japan, it was actually a Buddhist priest called Kukai who created the kana system.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Another thing about Shotoku is I think it was him where this is the case. There are talks of him not actually being a single person, but rather an amalgamation of multiple people who did a lot of things around the same time and who just so happened to like either know each other or like know similar enough people as to where they just attributed everything to one person named Shotoku.
Interesting.
Did say, what is it? The first of his Buddhist commentaries is considered the first Japanese text, the Hokke Gisho. And yeah, it's not in hiragana. I think it's still in the primitive, actual just Chinese, like straight up.
Yeah.
But if I'm correct, right, hiragana and katakana are both just simplifications of Chinese characters being used phonetically, right?
Yeah, they are simplifications, but like their purpose is different.
Like they were originally Chinese characters being used just as a sound, right? And they got, eventually they got tired of writing the whole Chinese character, so they just ended up doing two strokes.
Exactly.
Simplified to what it is now. That's what I was
thinking. Yeah. No, but that's an interesting thing you bring up, where like characters, entire kanji can be used to represent sound. Even today, you'll see that in some parts of Japan. I remember when I went to Tokyo for the first time, there was this really popular candy called Tokyo Tokyo banana, but they would spell banana with like kanji,
I
and
don't
I was like why?
Yeah, isn't that called a
Oh, that would
teji?
give me a headache.
Hmm?
Isn't that called a teji? Like sometimes
Teji?
there's words where the kanji is used completely for its phonetic like substitution, not for its meaning. So
Hmm.
like the word sushi, right? I think one of those characters has to do with like a governmental office or something. It's just it's just because yeah, it's no meaning is like acquired from the kanji. It's just used for its sound, and it sometimes looks fancy. So that's why I think why some people like substitute like cool kanji for like a simple word like banana.
Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting. Well,
but yeah, it's
actually, we at the Japan Club are guilty of that as well. I believe one of our older T-shirts, one that I have,
Oh dear.
spelled Nihon Kurabu with kanji only. So
No, there's a
oh
kanji
yeah,
for it actually.
that's
No,
like
that's
really
correct.
good wordplay in my opinion.
yeah.
Yeah, the word for club, like if you really stretch the like readings, yeah,
Mhm.
it says kurabu, right?
Hmm.
But that's like accurate readings for that kanji, and it
Hmm.
actually can sort of mean like fun gathering.
Yeah,
I don't know.
like
Yeah,
the
fun
kanji that are
section.
selected for kurabu, if you were to
Hmm.
like write it in kanji, is actually like similar enough to club to use it properly. Like I
Interesting.
I had a
Yeah,
whole
like
conversation about this when I was
it was
talking to
hilarious.
Japanese university students. They said the same thing, and it was pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
That's
my
interesting.
parents pointed it out when I wore the shirt in Japan. Like, that's not how that's supposed to work. I was like, I wasn't there when they made the shirt.
I wasn't there for this.
It's in the dictionary.
It's in the G Shock.
Directly take responsibility for that. Yeah.
That's funny. All right,
Just love how
so
divisive it is.
should
We
we?
talked about Buddhism briefly in terms of like but we talked a bit about Shintoism and sort of how that
Oh, yeah,
is relevant
that's
because that was the major
important.
religion of Japan
Mhm.
before Buddhism really came to.
Well, and I think to understand kind of how Buddhism affected Japanese culture, it would be good to kind of look or go backwards in time.
Yeah.
So starting now, right now, Japan is like, it has a really interesting kind of religious culture that is a mixture of both Buddhism and Shintoism. Um, from what I understand, most Japanese people are not particularly religious, but they are very adherent to kind of long-standing cultural practices. Um, and both elements of Buddhism and Shintoism are found in pretty much every aspect of Japanese religious life.
Yeah. Like like my dad's side is more Buddhist and my mom's side just kind of does the Shinto faith
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. So it's kind of an interesting mix and I have some experience when it comes to both religions for the most part. But that being said, like most of what Shinto really was spiritual worship. They believe that everything has a spirit associated with it, whether it's your house or this mountain or whatever. And
This
that spirit
giant
is,
tree in the backyard.
yeah, exactly. Like you can sort of communicate with those and appease them by giving offerings and performing ceremonies and stuff. And so temples were constructed in places of spiritual significance in a way to sort of, appease them if they were, for whatever reason, angered. That could cause things like illnesses or storms and all that stuff. And that's really the foundation of the Shinto faith. And then things like the Shinto gods would come up as, people accumulated these beliefs. They'd be like, oh, well, that thing in the sky, that bright red sun thing.
That
I
sun
bet there's a
thing.
really powerful spirit associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so really that's sort of where the Shinto gods come in there.
Another thing to note about Shintoism is that there's this large misconception around kami. So it's unfortunate, but we translate this into English as God,
Mm-hmm.
which is most often not the case. It can be the case, obviously. There are times where it literally does mean like deity and God, but the most accurate translation for it would be spirit, which is what's most commonly used in Shintoism. So if you read something describing Shintoism, it says they worship a kami, they're worshiping a spirit. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like anything good or necessarily anything bad. There are actually a lot of mischievous spirits that were worshipped so that they wouldn't like get screwed over later. And there are, like you were saying, spirits who are worshipped for the sake of, providing plentiful rainfall or not having your crops burned alive during a drought, like a lot of basic things. So if there's something that connected to daily life or connected to I guess just the way the world worked, there's very likely a kami of any level of power associated with it. And things that are more integral to the workings of the world, so like you said, the sun, the weather, things of that nature, those were oftentimes very high ranking and very powerful and universally understood kami.
So yeah, like it's true. For the most part, there is not really a distinction between like a spirit and a god in Japan, so much as like in the Shinto faith for the most part. Like they're all just kami, which means that like there's not like something, the only thing special about say Amaterasu versus some spirit that lives inside of your house is just sheer influence and power, but there's not like a sort of straight they're different beings in the same way that something like in ancient Greece where the gods are their own thing, but then something like a nymph or like some other magical entities distinct from a god,
Well, or even like in Christianity, they make the distinction between like both man and like heavenly creatures like angels, and then from angels to God. So yeah.
Exactly. So we do our best to we have to do our best to make sure that that distinction it remains clear for the most part. Because the Shinto faith is it's pretty strange, but I mean it's my favorite faith. I'm maybe in that regard. But then the impact that Buddhism had on it was mostly like they didn't directly conflict. There's nothing about Buddhist doctrine that would cause it to come in conflict with the Shinto faith for the most part. Like Buddha himself in the original mythology never claimed to be a god, never wanted to be worshipped. It's just like a way of living. And that's sort of like that's sort of why Buddhism was able to blend into Japanese society so well when something like say Christianity never really got a foothold in Japan in the later it was introduced.
That's a whole. There's a lot that happened with Christianity. That could be a whole separate podcast.
We'll probably
yeah.
Already.
Another thing to note about Buddhism and also by extent Confucianism, because Confucianism came over too, is I guess the social impact that it had. So I said offhandedly that there was an empress, like female emperor, at some point in time. That was actually very common. So in later periods, I'm bringing it up now because in later periods it's not necessarily quite like this. There wasn't really much of a distinction between like there was much of a preference rather for male heirs over female heirs, or women being in charge or men being in charge. It was basically just whoever's in charge is in charge, and that carried all the way up to the highest level of being the emperor. So there were times where the emperor would be a man, and then his daughter would become the emperor, and vice versa. And there wasn't really much of a focus on restricting the roles and obligations and responsibilities of the sexes. So you'll see a lot of pre-Buddhism really taking a foothold, and not Buddhism, Confucianism taking a foothold in the social aspect. You'll see a lot of talk of women leading entire entire sections of the country and whatnot, and of course being emperor. And this, I guess, freedom is slowly shifted to favor men over time. And I guess the role that women held changed, but the freedom with which they conducted themselves was not heavily restricted for a while. It took a couple more years for it to actually become male dominated.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you mentioned that. The last empress of Japan ruled from 1740 to 1813.
Yeah.
That is quite a long time, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
That is an extremely long time.
Oh, wait, no, that's her lifespan. No,
that's her lifespan? Okay, well,
ruling time is 1762 to 1771, which was not a very long time. But yeah, as you mentioned also, there's an Empress Shotoku, which I imagine is the aunt of that
Yeah.
we talked about.
Yeah, his aunt was empress at the time, and that's what gave him the ability to do so many things. Or in theory, if he was one person, allowed him to do so many things.
Right.
So yeah. Any other aspects of early Japanese history that we are missing at this current point?
I mean, we kind of
The
skipped
creation
over the.
myth.
Well, yeah, we can probably.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say like this would be a good time to transition into the creation mythos and how that.
I was looking at that bronze bell they have about the Yayoi, forever,
Mhm.
and it reminded me of Brozon, right? Like Pokemon, and yeah, it's like literally that
Bronzong the
bell.
Pokemon or
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, no, yeah,
Brozon.
bro, no, yeah. The Bronzong is
Bronzong?
literally one of the bells. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's like he's literally a Yayoi bell. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think it said in his Pokédex entry too that he was
Yeah.
a funeral bell or something of the sort.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd have
That's
to. I
hilarious.
haven't
Thought it was
seen
funny.
the entry in years because I haven't played Platinum in years,
Yeah.
and I never even got Bronzong to begin with. But yeah, I could see that being the inspiration for that Pokemon. Easy.
Interesting.
It's literally in the trivia section.
Is it actually?
Yeah, it's like
Bro, this man saw a barrel mount and thought there's a Pokemon for that.
Shout
any
object.
Shout out to Yamask.
Darumaka.
All right, so
they pull a lot from Japanese myth.
did we talk about the creation myths now?
We were gonna get to
Yeah,
that
we can
right
get
about
to
now.
that.
So, like, I mean, the myth itself can be it's very straightforward for the most part. Like, there's a lot of sub stories and stuff that people can say did or didn't happen, but for the most part, it began sort of with the two creator gods, Izanagi and Izanami, who, correct me if I'm wrong from getting this right, but essentially, as part of their sort of creation of the islands of Japan, there was like a giant spear that they embedded into the ground, and they danced around that, and that was part of their like ceremony.
Yes, the land came after though.
Yeah, I know. And then
So
they had
they're like in like a
chosen
bridge
word.
in the heavens or something. And
Yeah,
they're
it,
like,
like,
hey, what if
drips
I
from
just
the
dip
spear,
my spear? What if I just
Yeah.
drop my spear down? And at this point in time, I don't know if it was reality itself or just Earth, was purely the sea of things, nothing like definitive. So they dipped
Yeah.
their spear in, took it out, and like because it had their essence, I don't know what to call it, on it, it dripped this mud on the sea, and that became Japan.
Yeah.
And they kind of just went down there because they were bored.
In reality, there were like a couple generations of gods before then,
Yeah.
but they have names that are so long and so difficult to remember that for the most part, nobody really talks about them. All we really know about them is that of some of the second generation, as it were Izanami and Izanagi, they were really the ones that did a whole lot. Like the rest of them didn't do a whole lot, and their names would probably, be a reference to what they represented. But for the most part, they don't show up pretty much at all outside of like a description of the creation myth.
The other problem is no one can probably read their names anymore.
Yeah.
It's practically like reading Latin.
So they may have had relevance back when people were telling it, passing the traditions on orally, but
Gee, so long.
Yeah, so they were standing.
Hello.
They were standing on a heavenly ridge, and then they stirred the primeval ocean to create.
Dude, it's like some dining hall broth, and you're just like,
bro. I read the children's book version of this in Japanese. They were on a bridge, bro, and they were like, yeah.
What do you want for dinner, honey?
What do you want for dinner, bro?
Like, I'll eat smiling.
You know what makes it worse? It wasn't even honey at that point. It was, what do you want for sister, niece?
Oh.
That's what makes it worse. That's what makes it worse. And then they kind of just jump down.
Hey, to be fair, I'm reading here on Britannica that according to the lore, their first attempt to have a child resulted in a deformed child. So at least they were being accurate.
I mean,
no, Izanagi and Izanami, yeah, they kind of got together. We kind of brushed aside the fact that they were family for later.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's pretty
it's very
common. I mean,
It's
like
very
when there's
common.
only a few of them, there's kind of that
Yeah,
implication,
no, yeah, exactly.
like
But
starting it. But
So essentially, yeah. Ernesto, about to say something?
yeah, no, I was just gonna go ahead and talk about the other stuff, but
yeah.
I'll leave it to somebody else.
Yeah, so essentially they through the ceremony, which the first time they actually messed up because what's supposed to happen is that one of them was supposed to, Izanagi was supposed to greet Izanami first as part of the marriage ceremony, but they actually reversed that, and that resulted in the first attempt sort of screwing up. I'm sure there's some like event or some particular reason for that, but it's been quite a while since the myth was made. So all we know is that they screwed it up the first time, and then the second time they were successfully married, and then they had a bunch of children, many of whom were islands. But then there were, of course, the their elemental offspring, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
They were based on like for instance, Kagatsuchi is like a fire deity, and like they had quite a few of those, and eventually things seemed to be going well. But then when the aforementioned Kagatsuchi was born, because he was literally a deity of fire, when Izanami gave birth to him, she got like really badly burned, and that resulted in her dying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was sent to the underworld, which is called Yomi in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And most mythologies tend to have a version of the entering the underworld, and this is sort of where that comes in, where Izanagi is like, I'm gonna go down and get you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And then Izanami says, "All right, cool, I can go with you, but you cannot look at my face for whatever reason, like under any circumstance."
Very.
Which, the moment that Chekhov's gun was set up, they obviously had to fire it. So Izanagi couldn't resist. He looks around and her face is like rotting like a corpse, And Izanami gets so mad that Izanagi broke that rule that she like basically flies into a fit of rage, stays in the underworld and says, "I will kill 1,000 people every day, or for the rest of my existence."
Alternative take on that I also saw in another telling of the story. She starts chasing him because he's like, "I don't want that," and starts running away.
That's true.
And
That does
so she
happen.
actually ends up getting trapped in the underworld. So there's like a boulder that's outside of it, and she couldn't cross it right away. So you have to come in to like, greet her or whatever. And so he gets out before she does because apparently he's faster. I mean, that also has to do with him being associated with the, I guess, physical aspects of life, and he's not only being the more spiritual side of things, which is a whole different argument on the roles that people are supposed to have, but I could divide later. So he rolls up the bolt that was originally on the side of the entrance to Yomi. He rolls it over, and she's like pounding on the boulder, and then screams, "I will murder 1,000 people per day." And he says, "I'll just give birth to 1,500 per day." And then goes to wash himself, I think, of all of the stench of the underworld. And from that, we get Tsukuyomi, Amaterasu, Susano, and I think one other. Or no, it was just those three at first.
It was those three, yeah.
They Tsukuyomi's his left eye, and I think Amaterasu's his right eye, something like that. Yeah. And Susanoo is his nose.
Susanoo, yeah.
Yeah, my bad.
Yeah, no, it's the way that you see it, but there's an apostrophe between the first and second O.
Yeah. It also doesn't help that everyone who watches Naruto says it incorrectly, and it's ingrained in my mind incorrectly. I hate it so much. I hate saying things wrong. Anyway, yeah, he and Izanami kind of just create Kami by existing.
Yeah, no.
And that didn't stop after that altercation.
As you said before, because like both of you mentioned parts of the story as like different tellings, but
no, like I just forgot that part. Bryce is correct. The
most
accepted version of the story does involve her chasing him and then her getting locked out of the underworld.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. No, that was just my bad.
I figured it might have either been like a alternate reading of it or something.
Yeah, and the reason that she could no longer leave the underworld was apparently because she had eaten like fruit and had become one with the underworld or something.
Was it a pomegranate?
I don't remember what it was, but it just says she ate the fruit, and so she had become one with the underworld.
I mean,
I feel
this
like
has a lot of.
I feel like it was a pomegranate because when I read the story, I think I learned the word for pomegranate. I'm gonna check that.
Well,
Pomegranates.
this has a lot of overlap with Greco-Roman mythology. I mean,
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah.
it's a pomegranate in Greek mythology, but did they have pomegranates in Japan?
In Japan, probably not. No.
I wouldn't think.
See, you would think nah, but like,
Let me just
what does the
fruit
book
here.
say?
What does the sacred text say?
What does the sacred text say?
Wait, so what was the kind of Greco-Roman counterpart? What was his name?
Persephone.
Persephone and Hades.
Persephone and Hades.
But Hades Hades is the opposite. He didn't want Persephone.
No, but like not that one, but the guy
part,
who like
that's
has to go get his wife in the
Ernesto's thinking of
underworld.
Orpheus. And
Yeah, there you go.
Oh,
Orpheus.
yeah, I was thinking Orpheus. My bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds to me more like the myth of Orpheus than it does Persephone and Hades.
Just amalgamation.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's definitely elements of both that you would find in there.
Mm-hmm.
But is it related? That's what my question. Did they
That is
independently think of
certainly
this?
a question.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not
probably
sure if
not.
Period, or like I don't think there's a time overlap, right? So
Yeah.
it could have been independently thought of.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of common elements, right, with these like creation myths stories
Mm-hmm.
that kind of permeate through everything for some reason. Like
Mhm.
like the whole like waters, like that primordial waters thing is a common element, and even
Yeah.
like the Enuma Elish, right, the Babylonian myth.
Enuma Elish.
And like even in Christianity, the first creation myth draws heavily from elements like from they like a lot of people compare it to the Enuma Elish, that like the whole like creation of order by separating things from chaos, sifting through, sorting through, and creating order. That sort of thing is, every creation myth.
There's a lot of things that go into creation myths, like
there's
not directly related to the Japanese creation myth, just because you brought it up. There's also like a way to compare the creation myth of Adam and Eve to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, like you wouldn't think that right away, but there's a lot of like, even in things that aren't explicitly creation myths, there are elements that kind of have that same explanation for the dynamic between humanity and whatever is considered divine.
Mm-hmm.
So like in the case of the story of Izanagi and Izanami, you see it like the foundations and principles of reality by which the kami also have to obey. Like they are subject to death. They also have emotions. They also suffer. They also rot and can decay and are punished for their actions. So I think things like that are also like worth noting and can kind of cross over between cultures.
Mm-hmm. And then one other thing we have to talk about is the kind of children of Izanagi and Izanami. We have Susanoo and Amaterasu to talk about.
It's kind of weird to think of them as children of both, considering how they were created. But they're the least collaborative children of the two ever.
That's true. So if I remember correctly, Amaterasu was created from the left eye of Izanagi.
I thought it was right eye.
No,
I'm double checking this now. All
right, here it is.
Because I thought I had it right. Watch me get it. She is left eye.
Yeah, there you go. Haha.
I'm so upset.
But which god is it from? Because I forgot about that.
They're all from Izanagi. Wait, that's the Naruto one. No, that can't be right. Of course I get the Naruto result first.
No, wait. No, but I
yeah, it's inconsistent. He didn't switch it. Okay, yeah, it's the left. So left is Amaterasu, right is Tsukiyomi, and the nose is Susanoo.
Yeah. Izanagi. It's all Izanagi.
Yeah, it's all Izanagi. Because it was after he left the underworld, because he's like, I gotta get this underworld off me.
Yeah, okay.
So he goes to take
got
a
it.
bath, and as he's washing his eyes, he
like washes a god off his
literally. bro, that's how it worked. They would just be I shouldn't say it like this. They would just be, doing their thing, and they were just gods rolling off them in their sweat. Like,
Yeah. That's a really interesting kind of way to think about the creation of different deities. I don't think we see that pretty much anywhere else.
You'll see it in like D&D, in like actually.
But anyway, the story with I guess the most interesting story with Amaterasu is once when she got scared by her brother Susanoo, who was born from the nose.
Was she scared or was she just angry at him?
Well,
she
got startled, and so she got mad, and she was like, "I'm gonna go hide in a cave."
Yeah.
But since she was the sun that basically plunged the entire earth into darkness.
So if I recall, the way that worked was that Susanoo being this rambunctious person, because he's the god of storms after all, he throws a dead cow into one of Amaterasu's temples.
Yeah.
And she got so huffy of this that she locks herself into a cave and says vows never to come out again.
Yeah, no, the kami are
so
wild.
it wasn't a dead cow. It was a flayed horse.
It was
he flayed a horse and just flung it in there.
Yeah.
The other thing about Susanoo is like there's like a whole character arc he goes through after he's born. Like he gets like evicted, there's like a whole story just covering like his adventures of like finding himself and his role among the kami. Because after Izanagi like promises to make sure Izanami doesn't like screw him over. He like establishes a hierarchy of the gods or whatever, and they have like responsibilities, and people start worshiping him because for some reason at this point humanity is actually existing. And Susanoo is kind of just there, like he doesn't know what to. He's just there, and eventually goes on a whole adventure to find himself and do his duty as kami of storms.
And one thing that I was going to note is the similarities between the story of Susanoo and again like a Greco-Roman counterpart, primarily what I think is Hercules.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he like one of the first things he does like in this kind of journey after being exiled is he goes and kills like a giant 8-headed like snake looking thing.
Yeah.
And then like as a result he obtains this like mystical sword. So like everything is pretty
like really the Mitsuo, like Naruto for instance is a good example of how a lot is done to like base it off of the myth.
Yeah, like the most direct one is Itachi. It's actually hilarious. He's literally just the creation myth. His left eye is Amaterasu, his right eye is Tsukuyomi, his Susanoo, which is just literally Susanoo, has Susanoo's sword. It's called the Totsuka blade, and that's a different name for it, I think.
No, the Totsuka blade is different from the. Is it? Give me 1 second. I will look.
Because isn't the Totsuka blade no, because
Sakigari blade, which is a blade that was made from, it was a wine based, like a sake. Obviously means.
Was it? I thought it had the same properties as a.
Well, so
because the way that thing worked is like if it cuts you, you're dead. Which like
also with like Sasuke, this is from Britannica, and you had mentioned the name of the sword, but if here it says the name of the sword was Kusanagi, which is also the name
wait, Kusanagi no Tsurugi? That's something else.
It says Susanoo descended into the land of Izumo, killed an 8-headed dragon. From the tail of the dragon, he recovered the marvelous sword Kusanagi and presented this to his.
Wait, Orochimaru has a Kusanagi, and Orochimaru is a snake guy. So
yeah, no, like that sword is Sasuke's sword eventually.
Here's what I have figured out. So apparently, Totsuka blade is a generalized term.
Yeah. That's what I was saying. It's something else.
So, yeah, there's
right?
more than one, and that is the explanation for how the. How there can be you can explain how there are multiple and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think Totsuka's like a type, right? It says 10 handspans, like long. They
Yeah, it's 10 hand. Oh, yeah,
so,
right.
but
I
like
forgot about
there's
all
very
that.
like a specific Totska probably has like its own.
Yeah, that one just didn't have one. They just called it
That's
the
what I'm guessing.
Totska blade, and no one else questioned it.
Um,
Sasuke was like, okay.
But like, so Naruto is one example of an anime that draws pretty heavily on the creation myths. One other one that I can think of, which is currently airing, is one called Fire Force, and they
Yeah.
have this kind of
Yeah.
device in the middle of the city that kind of creates or powers everything, but it runs on like a fire, just an unsullied like flame.
But it
And
actually runs on spoiler, but
yeah,
It
I'm
runs
not
on
gonna.
spoiler, but
Yeah, all right. I'm not. I'm not gonna spoil it. But
imagine spoilers in my podcast.
yeah,
What
no, I will never
yeah,
spoil something.
the one in Japan is called
But it,
Amaterasu. Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Amaterasu, exactly.
So
Interesting.
the
Mhm.
lore.
So yeah,
The lore.
actually, the resolution of the myth, just to sort of loop back here, of the Amaterasu locking herself in a cave thing, is that in order to coax her out, it's kind of a weird story, but essentially,
Pretty funny. It's pretty
the
funny.
goddess of partying and festivities,
Mm-hmm.
among other gods, because all the gods all the kami kind of assembled to have this happen. She like does this dance that involves her like, she's the goddess of partying. What can you expect? But like she sort of like does this, throws off all of her clothing and stuff, and like it's all part of this dance, and they make this huge commotion. And Amaterasu is curious enough by the noise that she comes out, and
Yeah,
that leads to sort of them sort of jumping her and grabbing her and dragging her out of the cave to have the sun come back.
yeah. This is from the Ancient History Encyclopedia, and it says, in addition, the goddess Amenozume danced so wildly that the other gods' uproarious laughter finally excited the curiosity of Amaterasu.
Yeah.
And then
exactly.
she opened it for a bit, and they yanked her out. Yeah.
And then eventually, Susanoo apologizes and gives her the Kusanagi blade as sort of like a, I'm sorry, here's this.
Is he
I'm sorry,
welcomed
please
back
take this.
into heaven, or does he remain damned for the
I
rest of his
think
existence?
for the most part,
Doesn't he
for
just choose to
longer.
leave?
Yeah, he
Because
just
I remember he like leaves and has children elsewhere, and like no one questions him because he's found himself by this point.
Interesting.
But like the thing with the Shinto myths is that it's not like a story where there's like a sort of narrative through line that you can sort of track. And that can make it difficult to really sort of know, what happens to these people or to these characters after the events of their stories have resolved.
Canon.
Is that
Yeah.
canon?
So does is there kind of like a wider kind of point or theme that these stories try to get at, or
I
is
feel
it
like they
just
get at
kind
a
of
lot of themes.
like, yeah, this is what happened, that's it? I don't know. I feel like some stories are just like that, but maybe not.
I mean, at the root of most myths, right, is just like some explanation, usually, of at least maybe some like natural phenomena. So I'm guessing, like along the lines, some of that is the case, but I don't know much.
Yeah. Where are these written down, by the way? Like
Like
Two books, right?
actual written down or like the
like is
things that
there
we have
is there
now?
kind of like a scripture, or is it mostly like oral tradition?
There is a set of books called the Nihongi, which just detail out a lot of, it has the creation myth in there. It has a couple other things in there that mostly have to do with like the early history of Japan, but mostly the mythologized. Like there are a couple of emperors that exist in Japan that we don't know for sure existed.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
when I told you guys about the like the lineage of the Yamato bloodline, and that they had firm evidence going back 1500 years. It says that the first 19 emperors, like whether they existed or not, nobody really knows. So yeah.
Exactly.
Kind of just a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Like all we really know is that
Is that because like they were just like weren't really written down, or do you think maybe the evidence was lost over time?
Yeah, like they weren't really recorded as precisely, and then you have like conflicting kind of records of certain time periods, and so you don't know which emperor is supposed to go where. And that's kind of why they're not sure. I mean, probably some of them did exist. It's just they don't know which ones. So
I mean, yeah, like there's a lot of history that can't be confirmed. So, we can't, like, there are things in any mythology really that you could say we really couldn't tell exist just because we don't have the sources for it. Like, we don't know if Homer, for instance, wrote the Iliad or the Odyssey. We're pretty sure he didn't, but like, he at least, or if he learned it from somebody earlier than him, and he's the only one we remember. Like, we'll never know certain things just because it's not like we can archaeologically find some of those sources.
Right.
Get a time machine, forehead.
There are lots of problems with
Bro,
that.
just pull an FGO and like go back to that period and solve the singularity.
No, right now when you said time travel, I just got kind of nightmare flashbacks of when Tony Stark solved the question of time travel in like 5 seconds with an Avengers Endgame.
Bro, that was so funny. This man said, "Wait, what? Like, you idiots!"
Yeah, no.
I did it.
It was hilarious. Yeah, but yeah, I think there's always going to be an element of uncertainty associated with this kind of history, religious history in particular.
Yeah.
And that's just part of the deal. But
That's part of the deal, bro.
the Japanese creation myths to me are some of the more kind of wild and out there myths that exist today. I mean,
I don't know. There are some pretty crazy ones.
Yeah, there's some pretty interesting ones. Like,
bro, have you heard the actual myth for Chang'e in
who?
Chinese mythology? Chang'e. I'm probably not pronouncing her name properly at all. Close and better than most people would try to do it.
What did you just say?
Chang'e. I hate people. Anyway, no, like her myth is yikes.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of myths like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about something. Essentially, like, there's this idea, because I was just thinking about the similarities between this myth and sort of like those Greek myths that we talked about earlier, like especially the whole Izanami thing. And one of the things that is kind of important to know is that in a lot of cases, there might be an official source that is available to the West that may be different from one that is available to, the priests of the Shinto temples and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm thinking specifically of things like the sort of the Eddas from the Norse myths, where some people who translated those from the ancient texts into a readable language, some of them were very strongly Christian. And what they would do is they would sometimes throw in a bit of their faith into the interpretation of the Norse myth. A good example is Balder. Balder is this god of light, goodness, hope, and forgiveness. He's the only god that remains after Ragnarok. And like a lot of some people have tried to sort of spin that into, there's this other faith that exists where there's only one God and he's all about goodness and forgiveness and light and all that stuff. And there's some controversy about that. And I can't really confirm if the same thing happened to translations of Japanese text. I don't think so. I think it may just be one of those coincidences that come with creation myths and underworld myths. But at the same time, we can't rule out that possibility. And so it's certainly something interesting to figure out.
Yeah, definitely.
I would think that the translations wouldn't have been touched by anyone who firmly believed in us in like a faith that was not like already in Japan, just because of how long it took for faith outside of just the Asian area in general to actually have a foothold in Japan, so much so that they would be like the predominant translation of such an important myth, or really any important myth.
Yeah, that's
I could see it affecting like explanations of the myth, but like the core translation, which I think is probably what we have access to more consistently nowadays, would eventually just supersede that anyway.
Yeah, like I'm just pointing out that sometimes those things can happen.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Like, and so yeah, One thing that we haven't quite touched upon yet is how the creation myths and the myths in general really tie into Japanese history. And I think that's kind of an important thing to really set the foundation moving forward of Japanese history, because one of the most important things that happened is the bestowing of the three divine treasures to the Japanese royal line.
Yeah.
And that is like their symbol of power, the thing that gives them the right to rule by the gods, essentially.
Yeah, you still see the treasures referenced in media today. Like in Final Fantasy 14, there's a whole arc where you actually end up running into this like group of turtle people who are protecting the three sacred treasures. One guy just straight takes Ameno Habakiri. Another guy takes the mirror, and I think the Magatama is kind of just there. So like they're don't know what happened to the Magatama. But yeah, they're still referencing a lot of things today, and often are like, fun side items or the most powerful equipment in the game in other renditions.
They have a lot
so
of.
You'll see it in a lot of media.
But like essentially, like to be fair, even if you look online for stuff about the regalia, we don't we don't know if there was an original set of items that would have corresponded to those. All we have are like, well, this is what hypothetically they would look like. So the three regalia are the sword, the mirror, and the jewel. And each one of those has their own stories associated with them. For instance, the mirror is said to be the mirror that, we forgot to mention this, during the myth of Amaterasu being trapped in the cave, when she poked her face out of the cave, they shined a mirror at her, which, because she's the sun, temporarily stunned her.
Yeah.
And that is kind of important. And so that mirror has significance in that particular myth, just because of the way in which it is related to, royalty and then to the gods. So the sword as well, I believe, has significance. I think in one of the myths, the prince used it to set an entire field on fire or to put out that field with a gust of wind.
Yeah. I forgot that they used the mirror to stun her, because I knew it was her mirror. I just could not remember what it was for.
Well, and then the jewel, I don't like. The jewel is it's sort of the least referenced in this. It's called a magatama, and they're sort of used. They're that symbol looks like a 6 or a 9, depending on which you want to look into it. They're used sort of in Shinto ceremonies, but for the most part, I don't recall any specific myths where the magatama was used.
Yeah, I haven't been able to see anything pertaining to it specifically. I've heard it described as the most elusive one to like get anything definitive for. All I know is that it's supposed to represent benevolence and things of that nature, which is why it's bestowed upon the royalty. Oh, on that note,
the sword is just the Kusanagi blade. Never mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just Kusanagi.
That's my
each one of the treasures represents a particular virtue, which is why it's held in such high regard for the emperor. So because it's under the emperor's possession, it's implied that the emperor has these traits. So the sword, because the sword is supposed to represent valor. The mirror, because it belongs to Amaterasu, is supposed to represent wisdom. And the magatama, because of its like sheer value, I guess. I'm not sure what gives it such value, but apparently it's really valuable. It's supposed to represent benevolence, because you have the wealth of a nation and the wisdom and courage to distribute it accordingly. Something like that.
So those are important because of their significance in the modern day as well. Like in future episodes, when we talk about things like the Sengoku era and sort of the Warring States era, there's all sorts of things about whether or not like how important the emperor is, regardless of how, like, being the shogun is something you can become by just being a powerful guy and having a lot of influence.
Yeah.
But you can't really, like, how do I put this? If you want to become the emperor, you better have reasons beyond just being the strongest person.
Yeah.
And that plays a role in Japanese history quite a bit. So that's definitely something to talk about in the future episode. All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in terms of time, we're definitely running a bit on the later side. So if we want to have some closing thoughts, maybe talk briefly a bit about how maybe just the myths have translated themselves into the modern day, like not just like historically, but also culturally. Does anyone have anything to say? We've talked briefly about this before, just in terms of, its impact on popular media, things like anime, things like video games and all that stuff. Anyone have anything to add really to that?
You're muted.
Yeah, I am muted. No, so I don't really have anything to add with regards to how it continues to affect kind of pop culture today. I think we've already said a fair deal about that. I was just going to say that I did find the kind of virtues that each thing represents. So it's valor for the sword, wisdom for the mirror, and benevolence for the jewel. And yeah, that's it.
Outside of that, I mentioned earlier how like little, I don't know if you'll see it as much in like how people look at the world contemporarily in Japan, but in terms of impacts that it has on later periods that we're going to cover, I think it's a bit more tangible, like the impact of Izanagi the male being the one who has the spear, and Izanami being the one who kind of just makes sure things run smoothly and is on the more spiritual side of things. How that plays a role into like the atmosphere of an emperor's reign, for instance, or the role that the wife or husband of the emperor plays. So you won't see it as much nowadays. It's definitely more the thing that it's kind of just in media. Japanese people happen to catch it. Very easy to see. But in terms of it having like a concrete impact that you can like identify, I think you'll see it a lot more in the later eras that we're going to cover.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is sort of the setup because, like we said earlier, not a whole lot really happens that we know of, but things will start to pick up. And
it gets messy really fast, really soon.
Yeah,
so,
but also really cool. So.
Oh yeah.
For future reference, we'll probably be doing one of these maybe once every 3 episodes or something, just to kind of keep the pace
Yeah,
decent.
something like that.
And we'll see how it goes. If you guys like this kind of content, or you like this, us to talk about history more, feel free to let us know anytime. We'll always be open to that kind of thing. So thank you very much for watching. We'll see you guys next week.
All right.
Farewell, everyone.
Catch you guys later.